Okay, this is a lecture about the Second World War, but let me begin by giving you some reminders of where we're at in the class so you can go off to spring break firmly situated. I said at the very beginning of the semester that this class was going to be organized around an account of the rise, fall, and return of liberalism. And so far in the class, we've seen how a sort of new liberal vision of the world emerged out of a critique of the ancien regime in the 18th and early 19th century. And we've also seen how in the late 19th and early 20th century, new critical voices about the liberalism that had come to predominate in the 19th century developed through a variety of economic and political crises. The last few lectures have looked at the role of the First World War and have tried to explore the degree to which it marked a decisive turn away from that type of liberalism and the ways in which it at least began a new set of priorities, placed a new set of priorities around the idea of social community over the individual and of planning over a more laissez-faire approach of the state. What I've tried to indicate was that in the 1920s and the 1930s, the state began to play a more interventionist role in securing some sense of social community. Now, the Second World War is often given a key role in that shift. It's often seen as the decisive moment of change and transition towards a new economic and political system that came to be known as social democracy. Political democracy, we know, arrived in 1918 and 1928 when everyone got the vote, but social democracy was about providing to all members of society access to new and expanded social rights, and to do so through the active management of the economy by the state in the name of delivering these social rights. Okay? And the Second World War is, as I say, the time in which many people see this shift as decisively occurring. So I'm going to start this lecture basically by asking two key questions that revolve around this idea of a transition or of a shift. The first is that one of the most intriguing things that happens in the Second World War is that the working class that had in many ways been reviled during the interwar period, reviled because they seemed to to reflect the conditions, the failing conditions of the economy, of poverty and of unemployment, reviled because they would seem to have unreasonable wage demands in an era of austerity, reviled because they were thought to be beguiled by mass culture, and so on and so on. Somehow, during the Second World War, working people begin to be seen in a profoundly new way as the sort of bedrock of the nation, the very foundation of the nation. And so one key thing we have to try and explain today is how that occurs. The other key question that I'm going to try and explore today is the degree to which the Second World War radicalized those working people, and whether it led to a new social democratic idea of a people's peace that would follow the People's War. Okay? It's a remarkable thing that the Second World War becomes known as the People's War, and it's supposed to give way to this post-war settlement known as the People's Peace. And always in this discussion, you have to remember that some of these very same moves were made during the First World War, when many working class people thought that they were going to be returning home to a new type of social contract that didn't quite materialize. Now, traditionally, there have been three types of answers to these questions, and they break down across broadly the political affiliations of the historians who have tried to answer them. The first was what I would describe as historians working broadly within a social democratic tradition. These were historians who, in a way, came of age at this very moment. And for them, the war was a type of peaceful revolution, a revolution that radicalized the people, that gave way to the foundation of the welfare state and the first landslide victory of the Labour Party in 1945. And the finest exponent of this view is one of my childhood heroes, a historian called A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote the version of the Oxford History of Britain that finished in 1945. This is the final paragraph of his book. In the Second World War, the British people came of age. This was a people's war. Not only were their needs considered, they themselves wanted to win. Future historians may see the war as a last struggle for the European balance of power or for the maintenance of empire. This was not how it appeared to those who lived through it. The British people had set out to destroy Hitler and National Socialism. Victory at all costs. They succeeded. No English soldier who rode with the tanks into liberated Belgium or saw the German murder camps at Dachau or Buchenwald could doubt that the war had been a noble crusade. The British were the only people who went through both world wars from beginning to end. That's a dig at America. Yet they remained a peaceful and civilized people, tolerant, patient, and generous. Traditional values lost much of their force. Other values took their place. Imperial greatness was on the way out. The welfare state was on the way in. The British Empire declined. The condition of the people improved. Few now sang Land of Hope and Glory. Few even sang England Arise. England had arisen all the same. Stunning stuff. And a great model to you budding historians to write in very short sentences. Fantastic stuff. So that was the first thing, that the war was basically this dramatic transformation and all to the good, clearly. That view predominated for much of the post-war period, and it was challenged from the 1970s by a new generation of historians of the right who wanted to reinterpret 1945 and the big Labour victory then and the creation of the welfare state that followed as a wrong turning in British history. A wrong turning that indeed had heralded the decline, the economic and global decline of Britain in the decades after the Second World War. They argued that in fact the British people hadn't been radicalized during the war. What had happened was that they had been hoodwinked by left and liberal intellectuals working at the Ministry of Information and the BBC, and that historians had taken for granted the types of propaganda efforts that had been put out during the war. And clearly for these historians, who the issue here was, okay, how do we get back to the type of free market liberal economics that had existed in the period before 1939, or really before 1931. And then, in the middle of these two warring factions of historians are a group of people that I would describe as revisionists, okay, who try to find a new type of interpretation that recognized that actually the war was not really a revolution, that in many ways all it did was provide the accelerated trends that had been in progress during the 1930s, and that in fact, when social democracy and the welfare state arrived, it continued to be marked by very important influences from the earlier forms of liberalism. And they tried to show that by showing that the welfare state and indeed the war effort continued to be structured by a very uneven experience, structured in terms of gender, race, and class. So clearly, this set of arguments about the Second World War is a very contemporary discussion. It's really, like most historians, an argument about the present in which the Second World War is just the point of access to that argument. It's hugely important still in the British national story, what you think of the Second World War and the transformations it did or did not herald. So enough about historians. Now let's get to the main event. I'm going to be talking to you overwhelmingly today about the war in Britain, okay, how it was that Britons experienced the war. But I want to begin by emphasizing yet again that just like the First World War, the Second World War was an imperial war. It was fought in North and East Africa as well as South and Southeast Asia. 2.5 million Indians were part of the British military effort. 36,000 die, 65,000 are injured. And there are also troops from across the British Empire. Lots of West Indian, Caribbean regiments, African regiments, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, etc., etc. But in other respects, it's really quite different from the First World War. In Britain itself, it's a less dramatic experience in terms of casualties. It's actually the most violent and deadly world war of the 20th century. There were a total amount of casualties of between 50 and 70 million people, and most marked, of course, was the scale of civilian casualties, which also ran to 50 million people. But whereas 1 million service people had died across the British Empire during the First World War, only 382,000 died during the Second World War, and 67,000 civilians. It's a much less deadly war in Britain. And the same is not true in Germany, where 5.5 million servicemen die, 5.5 million people die, and in Soviet Russia, of course, where deaths reach 10 million people. So in some ways, Britain gets off remarkably light in the Second World War. But what is profoundly different about it is two elements. First, it's fought from the beginning with a conscript army. Remember, the First World War, for the first 2.5 years of the war, was fought by a volunteer army, and then they had to bring in conscription. That debate was over by the time of the Second World War. And the second key difference was there was a much smaller difference between people in Britain and those fighting on the front line. In many ways, people talk about the Second World War as collapsing the distinction between the home and the front lines. And that happened remarkably early in the war. It happened basically in June 1914, when the British military suffered a devastating series of defeats that culminated with the evacuation of Allied troops from the beaches of France around Dunkirk. Thereafter, Britain is under attack, and the war takes place mainly in the seas and the air around Britain, most famously with the Battle of Britain and the Blitz that basically lasts from the end of August through of 1940 through to May 1941. People, in other words, felt in the early stages of the war that the imminence of German invasion was very real. At the beginning of the war, for instance, 38 million gas masks had been distributed to the civilian population. And of course, the Blitz made the experience of conflict very real. Cities like London and Coventry and Plymouth and Glasgow and Belfast are pounded by bombs. And there are a series of invasion scares during 1940 and 1941. Now, I talked in some ways about how in the First World War the British people were mobilized primarily through an attempt to introduce things like a voluntary rationing instead of compulsory rationing, and through the attempt to develop new forms of production through the Ministry of Munition. Again, the scale of mobilization in Britain during the Second World War is unprecedented. It dwarfs that which had occurred in the First World War. Because it was felt if the war was going to be successful, everybody had to be involved, not just because they were potentially under attack, but because it would require all the resources of the country to resist defeat and invasion. And so to an unprecedented extent, the government was interested in the attitudes of ordinary Britons and sought to influence those attitudes in new types of ways. A Ministry of Information was created immediately after the outbreak of war, and the BBC was put into full service, really, as an outpost of that Ministry of Information. They also begin to use the new techniques of opinion polling and social surveys to try and discover what it was that people were thinking, so that they could tailor this propaganda effort more effectively. So mass observation is hired to do investigations into people's morale and their responses to different government campaigns. The British Institute of Public Opinion starts to be hired by the government to do research. And the Wartime Social Survey in 1940 does a whole series of different investigations. By 1943, it has 55 full-time staff, all of whom were women, traveling around the nation to do surveys on specific issues, whether it was about the quality and accessibility of food, the nature of clothing, health campaigns, etc., etc. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the Second World War really does mobilize the British people and create a new type of relationship between them and their government. Part of that mobilization was about locking in a particular script of the war. This script of the war that the Second World War was a people's war, and that the work of the government was an expression of that popular sentiment. And this really gets consolidated very early in the war, and certainly by the time of the great disaster of Dunkirk that you see, an image from which you see behind me. Dunkirk was a total disaster. The Germans basically captured 1 million Allied soldiers, and there were 60,000 casualties. But 500,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches of France, and they were saved not just by a flotilla of naval vessels, and there were destroyers and personnel ships sent out, but in the mythology that was quickly established thereafter, by a flotilla of small ships. That people with small boats across the southern and eastern coast of England went en masse to go and pick up soldiers off the beach and bring them home. So this military disaster was very quickly turned into what the British do best, which is a story of glorious failure. Rather like Scott's trip to the Antarctic, rather like every World Cup campaign that the English soccer team has been in since 1966. The ordinary people stepped in to make good the errors of incompetent military commanders. And at that point, they began to be seen as active in the defense of liberty and democracy. Now remember that much of the criticism of the working classes and ordinary people in the 1930s was that they were passive consumers of mass culture, that they weren't sufficiently civically engaged. This was a moment of decisive change. And at the center of this, the building of this new mythology were left liberal intellectuals who had been, in some ways, the critics of those very same working classes in the 1930s. People like George Orwell and J.B. Priestley, who both broadcast out of the BBC during the early years of the war. And they used their broadcast after Dunkirk to argue that Britain was experiencing what Orwell called an English revolution. That this new sense of active engagement in the war effort shouldn't just be about the defense of the nation. It should be about the construction of a new vision of the post-war nation. That the fight wasn't just for the war, it was a fight to build a people's peace. A people's peace which wasn't just about liberty and democracy, but also about the construction of new standards of social justice and of social equality, even. What they wanted was to argue that Britain should never return back to the conditions of poverty and unemployment that had been so rife in the 1930s. And that emphasis became an important part of the rhetoric of the People's War that began to be structured around this idea that all people had to suffer equally, that everybody had to be equally engaged in the war effort. And so these two phrases that I'm going to come back to again and again today. The idea of equality of sacrifice, that everybody must give up something and share in the suffering. And the other idea is the idea of fair shares, that everybody through rationing would get their own fair share. These ideas of an active, engaged citizenry defending the nation and doing so on equal terms became put out in a whole series of war propaganda films by the Ministry of Information. And I'm going to play you a clip now from The Heart of Britain in 1941, directed by Humphrey Jennings. Humphrey Jennings was one of the founders of mass observation, okay, and a key figure in the emergence of the documentary film movement in the 1930s. So the key thing that you want to get there, apart from the genius of the film, which is just, I think, still amazing, is that the heart of Britain is now the working people of the industrial north. And that in that film, you see ordinary people contributing, making the war effort. It's their culture, their way of life that is being defended, and their skills and industry that is making making Britain survive the war effort. And that's a really remarkable transformation. Central to that idea of popular mobilization, I'm suggesting, is this idea of equality of sacrifice, that everybody had to share in their struggles, and that the distribution of resources and of suffering would be evenly distributed, that there were going to be no distinctions of class in the conduct of war. And I'm going to try and show that to you through these 4 examples of talking about rationing, talking about the Blitz, talking about evacuation, and talking about the question of race and empire. And one of the key things that I'm going to try and get at in these examples is that despite this idea of equality of sacrifice, despite this idea of fair shares for everybody, there are continued differences of gender, class, geography, and race that are structured in to the conduct of the war effort. So there's this great ambition to build a new universal idea of society in which everybody is included, and yet there continues to be real limitations to that, which I think will be important in the post-war period. So first, let me talk about rationing. So rationing is immediately introduced, like conscription, at the outbreak of the war. Again, very different from the First World War. And from 1940, the Ministry of Food is run by Lord Woolton, who was a northern businessman and a peer who supported the Conservative Party. It's very significant that Woolton, a supporter of the Conservative Party, a peer, a lord, develops this idea that rationing was going to be based around the idea of fair shares for everybody. That the point of rationing was to make sure that Britain's limited food supplies, remember, it's totally dependent upon food imports at this point. The war in the Atlantic to try and stop the food arriving in Britain was intense. That this limited food supply was going to be distributed evenly across the population. Even the royal family, it was frequently reminded the British people, had their ration cards, although no one saw the king actually down at the store getting his ration card ticked off for his pound of sugar. Rations were universally set. That is to say, everybody had the same allowance of foods, and everybody had to deal with the new challenges of things like powdered egg, of spam, and worst of all, American bacon. There were special exceptions to the universal ration. There were special categories of people. Pregnant mothers is a good example of that. Heavy industrial workers is another good example of that. And children that were each given their own allowance of rationing to take account of their own unique nutritional needs. And just as in the Second World War, just as in the First World War, women are really at the forefront of the management of the food problem. It's women who have the complex task of trying to manage the rationing allowance for the whole family and of making those rations survive the week. And this gives way to what the Ministry of Information and the Ministry of Food described as the kitchen front, that women had a key role to play in the war effort in the kitchen. This was their key contribution. One of the remarkable things about rationing is that over the course of the war, the nutritional health of the British population actually improved, because nutritionists were involved in the calculation of nutrition allowances and of the types of foods that would be able to deliver that. Here in itself was a very fine example of the type of positive benefit, positive social benefit, and active state involvement in the planning and distribution of food supply could give out. Rationing was also about the creation of a new sense of community. And so one of the things that they did was create a new type of restaurant called the British restaurants, very unimaginatively named, but they were basically communal restaurants where you could go and eat very cheaply. By 1943, there were over 2,000 of them, serving over 600,000 meals a day. There were 281 in London of all, and they were meant to be places where people from all classes could go and eat cheaply and nutritionally. In fact, they were deeply unpopular. Many people didn't attend them. The Wartime Social Survey found that only 20% of the population had actually been in one. But the image of the communal restaurant was an important one, and the vision of community that it created. But of course, rationing, despite its universality, still had an uneven effect on the population. And the chief reason for that was the existence of a black market for foods. People who had more money could afford to buy additional foods on the black market, and luxury foods, things like caviar, for instance, was unrationed because there was no shortage of supply for it. So high-end London restaurants like the Savoy continued to do a roaring trade. In fact, they actually increased their trade during the Second World War because high-end restaurants, were a way in which the rich were able to continue to eat well. It also made a difference, of course, whether you lived in the city or the countryside. If you lived in the countryside, you could harvest the foods of the countryside. You could snare rabbits, you could pick blackberries and other fruits that grew wild. You could shoot birds, etc., 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 which people in the cities were not able to do. But of course, the greatest difference was between those in Britain and those across the rest of the empire. And the biggest sign of the inequity of food provision was the very horrendous famine in Bengal in 1943, where an estimated 3 million people died as a consequence of the famine, which basically was a consequence of the fall of Singapore in 1942 and the loss of the rice imports that came in from Burma. But there was still plenty of food in India. The question was one of the distribution of it to the most vulnerable people, which the government was ineffective at doing, and this became a huge cause célèbre for the nationalist movement and was very important in their campaigns for independence thereafter, which comes rapidly after the end of the war. So, universality, equality, but still strains of important difference and exceptions. The same is true of the experience of civilian bombing and the Blitz. During the Blitz, 43,000 civilians die and 1 million homes are destroyed. It creates a massive housing shortage in Britain, which post-war urban development tries for many decades to make good, as we'll see in the coming weeks. Britain was in many ways, a bomb site for the best part of a decade or two after the Second World War. But out of this experience of the Blitz came the propagation of a new sense of social community, a new idea that everybody was in it together and everybody had to help each other out. And that was, in a way, best symbolized in the communality of the air shelters. So in London especially, the tube stations were used as communal air raid shelters, where people of all classes could go to get below ground. But, as you can see from this image, there were also private shelters, known as Anderson shelters, that you could buy a kit and dig these shelters into your back garden. And this was something that really only the suburban middle class could afford to do, or indeed had the space in their gardens to do. So there's differences of class that are established in terms of the experience of the Blitz. There's also differences of geography, again, in that the areas that suffer most during the Blitz are the heavy industrial areas around London, around the ports of London, Belfast, Glasgow, Plymouth, and Coventry, which are the cities that are most badly hit during the Blitz. Because working class housing is close to the big industrial sites in these areas, it's the working class houses that are most frequently destroyed en masse. So, just like rationing, the experience of bombing had real an uneven experience for many Britons. Let me talk about evacuation. To deal with the imminence of German bombing raids, it was decided to evacuate children from these urban industrial areas. And over the course of the war, 3.5 million children are relocated outside of these areas. That happens in 3 phases: in September 1939, immediately after the declaration of war, during the Blitz itself, and in 1944 when there was a new wave of doodlebugs. Doodlebugs were like drones, basically. They were unmanned bombs that came over. You would hear them, then the engine would cut out, and when the engine cut out, you knew you were in trouble because it would like scream, you know, on the way down to hit the ground. So 3 waves, but the real idea behind evacuation was that the nation was one big family. The nation was a family in which the children were transferable units, that it would make sense that any family would take in the children of another family because they were all in it together. Everybody would help each other out. Of course, the real issue about evacuation was that it was predominantly working class children that were part of the official schemes of evacuation. And these working class children were bussed out or sent out on rail to evacuation depots where families would come in and pick the kids that they wanted. It's like that horror in the school playground when you're playing kickball, you know, and you're the last kid to be chosen. Not that that ever happened to me, obviously. But that type of horror of informal selection. Despite the fantastic idea behind evacuation, of the idea that the nation was one big family, what in fact it did was to emphasize really profound social differences. So middle-class families in the countryside, which tended to be the ones that would take in working-class children, were deeply shocked very often at the scale of poverty and ill health of the kids that they were picking up. There were also real scandals that began to break around evacuation, of families taking in children and basically using their ration cards to supplement the food of the entire family and treating the kids that they're hosting, putting them on a very minimal diet, or using them to do forms of domestic labor and even of physical abuse. Middle classes were basically not part of this official evacuation scheme. Instead, what they would do was make arrangements informally with friends or part of their extended family. So my mother, for instance, was evacuated from London to go live down in an area about 40 miles away with the family of someone that her father worked with. He worked in the sort of Clapham area. My father did the same thing, was sent down to a farm down in Devon. That's a very different type of experience of evacuation to the official one. Social scientists had a field day during this operation because they were hugely interested in the consequences of evacuation for children. And one of the key figures here was John Bowlby, the psychologist, who, along with a whole bunch of other psychologists and psychiatrists, began to study the psychic effects of evacuation on children. And John Bowlby develops this idea, this theory of attachment theory, about the importance of intimate relationships between mothers and their children in order to develop a well-adjusted child. And he basically argued, and I'll come back to this in a future thing, that if that attachment between mother and child is severed at a too early age, that you would end up with a child with deeply antisocial tendencies that were, of course, termed juvenile delinquents later. So the idea that came out of this was actually of the profound importance of the family unit being maintained together. I'm going to run through this and then I'll stop so any of you can ask me some questions. I've already said that the Second World War was no less of an imperial war than the First World War. Bless you. And you'll remember that after the First World War, colonial soldiers often felt very disappointed about their lack of political rights that followed their contribution to the defense of the British Empire. There's a sneezing bug going around. Come on, we've all got to get to spring break not sick. So the colonial office is very concerned about this from the get-go. And one of the things that they do is to try and address this issue at the beginning is to lift the colour bar in the military, to allow basically mixed regiments of soldiers. Nonetheless, it's the case that despite the lifting of the colour bar and the differentiation of so-called coloured regiments from white regiments, that all colonial soldiers were put under the control of British officers. Colonial soldiers weren't considered to be strategically or effective enough to run their own regiments. It's also the case that there were no black servicemen in the Navy. There was a big population of so-called coloured seamen in the merchant Navy, but none in the Navy per se. And Winston Churchill was also insistent that insofar as black medics contributed to the war effort, they should not serve white servicemen. That Caribbean and African and South Asian medics, of which there are a number, should basically attend only to colonial soldiers. So there's a lifting of this colour bar, but it's a sort of grudging one almost. Nonetheless, there's a very important emphasis on this idea of colonial partnership, an emphasis on partnership across the British Empire. That rather than the British Empire being structured in this deeply hierarchical way, with everybody rallying around the chief of all nations, the mother country of Britain, instead the propaganda was that everybody was contributing to the war effort as a family, and that there wasn't that ingrained hierarchy. And this type of rhetoric becomes very important also after the Second World War, because it becomes the basis of the new idea of the Commonwealth of Nations, the shift from the British Empire to an idea of a Commonwealth of Nations. I'm pausing because I've lost my train of thought. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go. there was a huge contention in Britain with the arrival of the belated arrival of American servicemen. And one of the reasons why this was so contentious was because, of course, the colour bar continued to exist in the American military. Churchill tried very hard to be in discussions about the lifting of this colour bar. It was considered politically impossible in the American context. And so American military bases and regiments in Britain, housed in Britain, continued to have the very form of racial segregation that the British military had worked so hard to move away from. There were 130,000 African American GIs in Britain, and for the towns surrounding those, like my hometown of Ipswich, which was very near a whole series of American military bases, now had to have distinct bars and clubs just for those GIs, because they weren't allowed to mix socially with other people. But of course, they found a way, and that much to the horror of their commanding officers and to some of the popular press, there were 2,000 mixed-race babies born in the UK during the war as a consequence of romantic relationships with these African-American GIs. And of course, British women fell head over heels in love with the strapping American men that came over to serve with their ample rations and their ample supply of nylon tights. There were 70,000 British war brides that returned to the US after the Second World War. I'm not going to get into the Bevin Boys stuff. So do we have any questions before we hit this last section of the lecture and ease gracefully into the experience of spring break? No? Yes? It was pretty much out of the picture. I mean, in part because it wasn't a pretty picture from Britain. The fall of Singapore was really considered to be a massive psychic blow to the British Empire. You know, many people think the fall of Singapore is the beginning of the end of the British Empire. You know, this humbling of the British military. So it's something that's out of that doesn't get anywhere near as much coverage as the war in Europe, or indeed the war in North Africa and the Middle East, both of which get a lot more coverage. Okay. Yeah. That's a great question, Malik. They are basically utterly supportive, in part because they're given a seat at the table in an unprecedented type of way. You have a national government in Britain during the Second World War, and a national government that has, unlike the national government in the First World War, a good number of ministers that came out of the labour movement. And and I'm going to move on to this now, many of the issues about Reconstruction develop in conversation with the trade union movement. And I'm going to come on to that now. So I talked last week, I think, about the increasing vogue for planning and the idea of sort of government and scientific planning in the 1930s. And this is really significant because suddenly, between 1940 and 1942, there's an unbelievable amount of plans for the post-war period published. People begin to have an active discussion about what Britain in the post-war period was going to look like. Churchill, when he became Prime Minister, actually had got rid of the War Aims Committee that had been established in August of 1939, and basically wanted to put off any conversation about post-war planning because, he argued, Britain just had to survive the war, and before anyone could think about the future, that the war had to be won. Nonetheless, he concedes to the creation in February 1941 for a new cabinet committee on reconstruction, headed by a member of the Labour Party called Greenwood, and that plays a very important role. Because out of one of its subcommittees emerged a document that was hugely influential for what happens in Britain after the war. It's a report known as the Beveridge Report. Beveridge had, you remember, been under Lloyd George's wing before the First World War, had devised things like the labour exchanges, had devised a rationing system in Britain during the First World War, had served as the director of the London School of Economics between the wars, and was made head of this interdepartmental committee on social insurance that had been created in 1941. The Beveridge Report is a key text that you have to get very, very familiar with, because what it does is lay the foundation for the creation of the welfare state in Britain. It expands the system of social insurance that had existed since 1911 into a universal scheme of social insurance that would embrace all of society, not just certain privileged workers as before. And the idea of this collection of social insurance for the whole country was that it would provide new forms of welfare that would cover people from the cradle to the grave, that the state would secure the welfare of its citizens from their birth to their death. And it outlined 5 great evils that it sought to put an end to: want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease. Want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease. Such was the impact of this report. Remember, this is an official government report. When you start reading it, you'll understand that this is not a gripping read. And yet, it gets an amazing reception. 92% of the population knew of its existence a day after its publication, according to opinion polls, and 100,000 copies of it were sold in the first month. The total sales ended up at 630,000, and there were even 50,000 sold in the US. In 1943, Lord Woolton, fresh from his success in the Ministry of Food, is appointed Minister for Reconstruction. Okay, so now you have basically a Conservative minister in charge of the plans for reconstruction, in which this radical new agenda is in place. Now, one reason why this report is so important is that it was well advertised and discussed, not just in the popular press, but in the army itself. And in 1941, they created something called the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, or ABCA, which was meant to facilitate discussion amongst servicemen. Okay, so the thing about the Army Bureau of Current Affairs is it was remarkably like the Left Book Club. It published short 16-page pamphlets, and those 16-page pamphlets were designed for public discussion in barracks that was facilitated by one officer. But basically, if I played you more of that clip, it was all about hearing from the men, and and trying to educate the men in the big issues after the war. And it's often suggested that the Army Bureau of Current Affairs plays a key role in terms of putting out knowledge about the Beveridge Report in the armed forces. Right. So let me wrap up. In one way, the English Revolution that George Orwell so longed for during the Second World War did arrive. It arrived in 1945 when, against all the odds, against all the predictions, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, the heroic Prime Minister that had saved Britons at the hands of German tyranny, was decisively thrashed at the election. For the first time ever, the Labour Party wins a massive majority of 149 seats in the House of Commons. It's the first major victory by the Labour Party. It's a scale of victory that the Labour Party didn't recapture until 1997, when Tony Blair was elected. It was unprecedented at that time. And it did so with 48% of the vote. And it was a Labour Party utterly committed to the creation of a new social democratic British future, structured around the Beveridge Report. And structured around the idea of a new type of state, a mixed economy, a combination of public and private ownership, therefore the nationalisation of certain key industries, and the creation of a welfare state, including the creation of a national health service that could deliver healthcare free for all. Now, historians argue a huge amount about how much this was a consequence of the war, how much all of this propaganda and projection of the society as a new type of community during the war actually helped Labour win. They also argue a huge amount about how much people were actively infused by Labour's agenda. In fact, we know that only 66% of the electorate eligible to vote actually registered. So this was not, people weren't rushing to go to the polls to vote in 1945. And there was a remarkably low turnout, not least in the armed services. The armed services that people thought had been radicalized by the Army Bureau of Current Affairs. Only 40% of servicemen voted. Whatever the degree of enthusiasm of the British people for this new system created in 1945, it clearly was a radically new type of system. The idea that the state should secure a new set of social rights that they would try to embed this idea of fair shares for all across forms of distribution was very, very new. The idea that the commanding heights of the economy could be owned by the state was profoundly new. And this system basically endures down to the late 1970s. So this is a decisive moment, whatever we might take of the how incomplete it is or how unenthusiastic or enthusiastic the British people would have. So the question that you have to figure out in the coming weeks after you are refreshed from your spring break in Cancun is where this fits in the longer story of the 20th century that I've been trying to tell you. And so there are basically two versions that you can have. One is that the Second World War consolidates and creates a new social democratic Britain. A social democratic Britain that actually we now know didn't last very long, because it only lasts down to the late 1970s, or you could argue, for some people would argue, through to the 1990s. Or was that social democratic Britain actually just a product of the new types of liberalism that had emerged in the 20th century, more concerned with social questions? Okay? In other words, does this social democratic system that's constructed in the 1940s illustrate the continuing hold of liberalism, just its redirection into different types of forms? And it's that question that we'll begin to try and unpack and explain in the lectures when you return from spring break, which I hope is extremely pleasant for you. You've worked very hard this first half of the semester, and you are very deserving of a break. So I will see you when you get back.